All right, so get this. Today we are doing a deep dive on something you hear all the time, especially in economic news.
Okay.
The word tariff. We've
Interesting.
got some articles about the word's origins and even how former President Trump used tariffs.
Wow.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
I'm sure it will be. Yeah, tariff. It's a word with a lot of baggage,
Oh, absolutely. It's not just, some boring economic terms.
Right.
A story,
Hmm.
really,
Yeah.
about culture, history, and even like power dynamics over centuries.
Mm.
So let's start at the beginning.
Uh-huh.
Tariff, our sources say, comes from Arabic.
Really?
Yeah, the word a,
Okay.
which means a lot of things.
Right.
It can mean notification or even definition,
Hmm.
much broader than just the way we use it today.
That's fascinating. And what's even more amazing is how that word,
Yeah.
traveled across so many different languages
I-
and cultures, picking up all these little shades of meaning along the way.
Right.
Think about it. From Arabic, it went to Persian, and then Turkish, Latin, Italian, French.
Oh, wow.
And finally, it landed in English.
It's like a world tour.
It really is. You can almost trace ancient trade routes just by
Okay.
following,
Yeah.
how the word itself evolved.
So it's more than just a word. It's like a historical artifact.
Exactly.
But jumping ahead to more modern times, our sources talk about how former President Trump, he really put tariff back in the spotlight.
He did. And I think that surprised a lot of people, right?
Yeah, because people think of tariffs as like kind of old school.
Yeah, like a relic of the past.
Yeah, and even protectionist.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
That's a key point here.
Yeah.
How tariffs are perceived. I
Yeah.
mean, Trump even called tariff his favorite word.
Oh, really?
At one point, he even said he liked it more than love.
Wow.
So it wasn't just an economic tool for him. It's almost like a way to,
Yeah.
project power on the world stage.
Yeah. So, like, what was his strategy there?
Well, he saw tariffs as a way to pressure countries
Okay.
like Mexico, Canada, and of course China
Right.
on a whole bunch of issues.
Like what?
Well, like illegal immigration,
Oh, okay.
drug
Oh.
trafficking. He even tried to use them to get a better deal on TikTok, remember?
Yeah, I remember that.
And of course, there's the whole trade imbalance with China.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't just about pure economics.
Right. It was about leverage.
Exactly. It was about using tariffs to get what he wanted on the world stage.
So, did it work?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Some people saw it as a brilliant negotiation tactic.
Okay.
Like, he was just threatening tariffs to get concessions.
Yeah.
But others thought it was a risky gamble.
Right.
They argued he was actually trying to change the entire way the U.S. approaches trade.
Really?
Yeah, like making tariffs a central part of U.S. policy.
So it wasn't just about
Mm-hmm.
those specific instances?
No, it was about setting the stage for a much more aggressive approach in the future.
That's interesting.
Yeah, definitely shook things up globally.
It did, but what about the actual impact?
Right.
Like, did it actually work?
Well, that's a complicated question.
Okay.
There were definitely some wins.
Yeah.
I mean, he got some concessions, some deals were renegotiated,
Okay.
but there was also a pretty big backlash.
What do you mean?
Well, the countries he targeted, they retaliated with their own tariffs.
Oh, so it was like a
Uh,
trade war.
yeah, it had that feel.
Mm-hmm.
Prices went up for consumers.
Okay.
Supply chains got disrupted.
Wow.
And international tensions, they definitely rose.
So for everyday Americans,
Mm-hmm.
what was the impact?
Well, studies have shown that the average American household ended up paying, hundreds of dollars more per year because of those tariffs.
Wow.
So some industries might have benefited, sure,
Mm-hmm.
but consumers, they definitely felt the pinch.
And that's kind of ironic, right? Because Trump campaigned on lowering the cost of living.
Exactly. It was a big part of his message.
But the tariffs seem to have done the opposite.
Yeah, it's complicated.
So was it a win-lose or somewhere in between?
It's hard to say,
Yeah.
You have to weigh the potential benefits against the documented downsides.
Yeah.
Did it give the U.S. more leverage in trade negotiations? Maybe.
Okay.
But did it also cause economic hardship for Americans
Mm-hmm.
and potentially damage relationships with other countries?
Right.
The answer seems to be yes there, too.
That leads to another interesting point that our sources bring up, the legal challenges to Trump's actions.
Oh, right.
It wasn't just about economics and politics.
Yeah.
It got legal, too.
Absolutely. There were a bunch of lawsuits questioning whether what he was doing was even legal, let alone,
Yeah.
constitutional.
So this goes beyond trade policy. It's
Oh, yeah.
about, like, the very foundation
Well,
of presidential power in our system of government.
Exactly. It touches on some really fundamental questions about how our government works.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, it gets pretty deep.
It does.
And one particular executive order from January 2025 really brought all of these concerns to the forefront.
Oh, what was that?
Well, it was this massive proposal to completely overhaul U.S. trade policy.
Oh, wow.
We're talking potentially trillions of dollars in trade being affected.
Okay, so what were the main points of this executive order?
Well, it basically directed all these different government agencies to review all the existing trade rules,
Mm-hmm.
many of which have been around for decades. And a lot of people saw this as Trump setting the stage for even more aggressive use of tariffs in the future.
So it wasn't just about individual tariffs, it was about
Right.
changing the entire approach to trade.
Yeah, exactly, like shifting the whole philosophy.
And of course, this caused a lot of debate.
You bet it did, especially among businesses,
Makes sense.
especially those that do a lot of international trade.
Yeah, they need to know what the rules are.
Exactly. They need predictability, and this threw a whole lot of unknowns into the mix.
Right.
And then there was the concern about what other countries would do.
Oh, right, like retaliation.
Exactly. It could have easily spiraled into this back and forth of tariffs,
Wow.
creating chaos in the global markets.
It's like a high-stakes game of chess.
Right. That's a perfect analogy.
Man.
And the stakes were incredibly high,
Yeah.
potentially affecting millions of people all over the world.
And our sources also mentioned some interesting reactions from Canada and Mexico.
Oh, right.
I mean, they were really on the front lines of this.
Absolutely. They were our biggest trading partners.
Yeah.
So they were directly in the line of fire.
So how did they respond?
Well, at first it was a mix of diplomacy and defiance.
Okay.
Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau,
Uh-huh.
he even encouraged Canadians to boycott U.S. products.
Wow. That's pretty gold.
It was. And it really showed how high tensions were running.
So was there a real risk of a trade war with our closest neighbors?
Oh, absolutely. But luckily, cooler heads prevailed.
Okay.
And after a lot of intense negotiations, they managed to reach some temporary agreements.
So a truce, but not a lasting peace.
Exactly. The fundamental disagreements were still there. And the potential for future conflict was still very real.
So it just highlighted how interconnected our economies are.
Yes. And how even seemingly small disagreements can have huge consequences.
Right, because trade policy isn't just about abstract economic theory.
No, not at all.
It's about real people's lives,
Uh-huh.
their jobs, their families.
Precisely. It has a very real human impact.
Okay, so we've talked about the political angles, the economic angles,
Right?
but our sources also go into some of the legal intricacies
Wow.
surrounding tariffs, and particularly this idea of customer clearances.
Interesting.
I have to admit, I'm not totally familiar with that term.
Yeah, it's kind of a technical term,
Okay.
but it's a really important part of how importing works.
Okay, so what is it?
Well, think of it as a quality control checkpoint for international trade.
Okay.
It's all about making sure that the products coming into a country,
Yeah.
they meet all the regulations and standards.
Oh, okay. So like
Mhm.
making sure there's no counterfeit goods
Right.
or harmful materials or anything like that.
Exactly. It's about protecting consumers.
Makes sense.
And it really shows how important international cooperation is.
Right.
If we didn't have these systems in place,
Yeah.
global trade would be a lot more chaotic and potentially dangerous.
That's a good point. And let's go back to the economic impact for a second.
Okay.
Our sources mention some specific numbers
Uh-huh.
that really show the potential consequences of these tariffs.
Like what?
Well, one study estimated that the average American household could end up paying an extra $1,000 to $1,200 per year because of them.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
It is, and it underscores how tariffs can hit people's wallets,
Yeah.
even if they don't realize it right away.
It's not always obvious, but it adds up.
And it makes the whole situation even more ironic.
How so?
Well, remember, Trump campaigned on making life more affordable,
Right.
but these tariffs seem to have done the opposite.
Yeah, it's another layer of complexity to the whole story.
It is, and our sources also talk about the role of the World Trade Organization.
The WTO, yeah.
It's often seen as the referee for global trade.
Exactly. They're supposed to make sure everyone plays by the rules.
Right.
But their effectiveness has been questioned a lot lately.
Really? Why is that?
Well, some countries, including the U.S. under Trump, have been unhappy with some of their decisions.
Okay.
And they've even blocked appointments to their appellate body, which is the part of the WTO that settles disputes.
So that weakens the whole system, right?
It does. If the referee can't enforce the rules, then what's to stop countries from just ignoring them?
It raises some big questions about the future of global trade.
It does.
Can the WTO adapt to this new world where national interests clash with, the idea of free trade and cooperation?
It's a huge challenge, and it
Mm.
goes way beyond just tariffs. It's
Yeah.
about the very foundation of how countries interact with each other.
That's a really good point, and it's also interesting how Trump's messaging on tariffs changed once he was in office.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, during the campaign, he talked about lowering costs,
Right.
boosting take-home pay for workers.
Uh,
It sounded like a win-win for consumers.
what the?
Once he started actually putting tariffs in place,
Yeah.
his tone shifted.
Mm.
He started acknowledging that there might be some short-term pain for consumers,
Okay.
but he framed it as like a necessary sacrifice
Oh, interesting.
for the greater good of making America great again.
So he was asking Americans to trust him.
Yeah, to trust that the long-term benefits would outweigh the immediate costs.
But of course, that raises questions about the political calculations involved, right?
Yeah.
Are tariffs really about economic reform?
Right.
Or are they sometimes just a tool for political leverage?
Even if it means hurting certain groups in the short term.
It's a tough question.
It is, and how do you even communicate all of this to the public?
Right.
Like, how do you explain these complex issues in a way that's honest and understandable?
It's a real challenge for any leader.
And it shows how important it is for people to be informed,
Absolutely.
to understand how these policies affect their lives.
Yeah, and to hold their elected officials accountable.
Exactly. And speaking of accountability, our sources also touch on some of the legal challenges
Oh, right.
to Trump's actions.
Uh-huh.
There were a number of lawsuits filed
Challenging what?
questioning the legality and even the constitutionality of his executive orders.
Like which ones?
Well, especially those related to immigration and trade.
Oh, right. There were a lot of those.
There were, and one prominent case challenged his attempt to deny birthright citizenship to certain individuals
Oh, wow.
born in the U.S.
I remember that one.
The lawsuit argued that it violated the 14th Amendment.
Which guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil.
Exactly. So it really went to the heart of what it means to be American.
It did, and it sparked a huge debate about presidential power and the role of the courts.
Right, because the courts are supposed to interpret the Constitution.
That's right. They're the ultimate check on the other branches of government.
And there was another case about the firing of 2 commissioners from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Oh, right. I remember reading about that.
The lawsuit claimed that their dismissals violated this principle of for-cause removal,
Yeah.
which is meant to protect certain federal agencies from political influence.
So they can do their jobs without fear of reprisal.
Exactly. It's all about maintaining the balance of power within the government.
It's a crucial part of our system of checks and balances.
So both of these cases were really about the scope of presidential authority.
Yeah, and the limits of that authority.
Right, and they highlighted the importance of a strong and independent judiciary.
Absolutely. They're the guardians of the Constitution.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have. It's amazing how much there is to say about tariffs.
I know, right? From the history of the word itself to the complex legal and political battles.
Uh-huh.
But our sources also include this really fascinating historical tidbit
Oh, tell me about it.
that connects us back to the word's origins.
I love those little historical nuggets.
It's about the Spanish town of Tarifa.
Tarifa. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, and it gives the word tariff a whole new layer of meaning.
I bet it does. What's the story?
Well, some historians believe that the word tariff actually comes from pirates.
Pirates. Really?
Yeah, they would demand payments from ships
Okay.
passing through the Strait of Gibraltar.
Aye.
And the town of Tarifa
Uh-huh.
was a notorious pirate haven.
Oh, wow.
And those payments they extracted, they were known as tarifas.
So the word that governs global trade today might have started with pirates demanding their cut.
Exactly. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It really is. It shows how much the world has changed,
Yeah.
you know. Back then, it was about literally controlling a narrow passage.
Uh-huh.
Today, tariff is about economic leverage and influence on a global scale.
It's amazing how a single word can hold so much history, isn't it?
It is. It really speaks to the power of language.
Yeah.
How it evolves and adapts to reflect the changing world around us.
And tariff is a perfect example of that. So we've explored the past, but what about the future?
Right, where does tariff go from here?
Is its role in international trade going to grow, diminish, or something else entirely?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Predicting the future of tariff is kind of like predicting the weather.
Okay.
There are so many factors involved.
Right.
But if we look at its journey so far, we might get some clues.
So what are those clues telling us?
Well, tariffs has always been about this tension
Uh-huh.
between cooperation and competition,
Okay.
between national interests and global trade flows.
Right.
And that tension, it's not going away. In
Mm.
fact, it's probably going to get even more intense in the coming years.
So tariff will still be a tool,
Uh-huh.
but how it's used will depend on
Right.
how these global dynamics play out.
Exactly. We might see tariffs used more strategically,
Yeah.
targeting specific industries or countries
Okay.
to achieve certain goals.
Mm.
Or we might even see a move away from tariffs altogether,
Oh, interesting.
replaced by new forms of economic leverage or trade agreements.
A lot of uncertainty, but definitely a lot to think about.
For sure.
So what does all of this mean for us?
Right. For the everyday people living in this world of global trade and tariffs.
Yeah, what does it mean for us?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that staying informed is crucial.
Okay.
We need to understand how trade policies affect our lives,
Uh-huh.
our jobs, the prices we pay for things, everything.
Because ultimately, we're the ones who feel the impact.
Exactly. We, the consumers, are the ones on the receiving end of these decisions.
So knowledge is power.
Absolutely. Especially in the global economy.
And critical thinking is essential too, right?
Oh, for sure. We need to be able to see through the rhetoric, evaluate different perspectives, and understand the potential consequences.
Yeah, it's like we're all players in this global game of trade,
I love that analogy.
whether we realize it or not.
And the more we understand the rules of the game,
Yeah.
the better choices we can make as consumers, voters, and citizens.
That's a powerful message. We're not just passive observers.
Nope.
We have agency, we have a voice.
Exactly.
Well said. And on that note, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final question to ponder.
Okay, I like it.
Considering the journey of tariff,
Mm-hmm.
from ancient times to the present,
Mm.
what does it tell us about this ongoing tug of war between national interests and global cooperation?
Ooh, that's a good one. It really makes you think.
Because the story of tariff is far from over. It's going to keep evolving as the
Yeah.
world changes,
Yeah,
and it's a story we all have a part in shaping.
I agree.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've gained a new appreciation for the power of a single word
Uh-huh.
to reflect the complexities of history, economics, and the human experience.
Well said.
It's been a fascinating journey,
It has.
and we're glad you came along for the ride.
Me too. So, yeah, this executive order, it really raised a lot of concerns about, the balance of power.
Okay.
It was like, is this really how trade policy should be made? You
Yep.
know,
Right.
bypassing Congress and all that.
So businesses were worried, right?
Oh, absolutely. Especially the ones involved in international trade.
Yeah.
I mean, they need stability, predictability,
Uh-huh.
and this just threw everything up in the air.
And then there's the whole issue of retaliation.
Exactly. Other countries, they're not just going to sit back and take it.
Right. They could impose their own tariffs.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you get this back and forth, this tit for tat,
Oh, wow.
that could really destabilize the whole global trading system.
It's a delicate balance, isn't it?
It is. It's like one wrong move, and the whole thing could come crashing down.
And our sources also mentioned some pretty interesting reactions from Canada and Mexico.
Oh, right. They were right in the thick of it.
I mean, they're our biggest trading partners.
They are. They had a lot at stake.
So how did they respond?
Well, at first, it was kind of a mixed bag. Like they were trying to be diplomatic, but also standing up for their own interests.
Right?
I mean, Canada's Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau,
Yeah.
he even encouraged Canadians to boycott U.S. products.
Wow. That's a pretty strong statement.
It was. It really showed how much this was affecting them.
So was there a real danger of a full-blown trade war?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, things were pretty tense there for a while.
But they managed to avoid it.
Well, sort of. They reached some temporary agreements
Okay.
after some pretty tough negotiations.
So a truce, but not a lasting peace.
Exactly. The underlying issues, they were still there,
Yeah. Just simmering beneath the surface.
And it really showed how intertwined our economies are.
Yeah.
And how even small disagreements can have huge ripple effects.
It's like a chain reaction, right?
It is. It really brings home the point that trade policy, it's not just some abstract thing.
Uh-huh.
It affects real people's lives.
Okay, so we've talked about the politics, the
Yeah.
economics, but our sources also go into some of the legal details.
Oh, yeah, the legal stuff can get pretty complicated.
It can, and they specifically mention this thing called customer clearances.
Customer clearances. Okay.
I'll be honest, I'm not totally clear on what that means.
Yeah, it's kind of a technical term,
Okay.
but basically, it's like a quality control checkpoint for international trade.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, like, when goods are imported into a country,
Mm-hmm.
they have to go through this process
To make sure of what?
to make sure they meet all the regulations and standards.
Oh, so like safety standards.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And labeling requirements, all sorts of things.
It's about protecting consumers, right?
Absolutely. It's about making sure that the products people are buying are safe and meet certain quality standards.
That makes sense, and it also shows how important international cooperation is.
It does. I mean, imagine if every country had completely different rules and regulations.
Oh, wow, yeah.
It would be a nightmare. Global trade would be so much more difficult and potentially dangerous.
And going back to the economic impact for a second,
Okay.
our sources mentioned some pretty specific numbers.
Yeah, like what?
Well, one study estimated that the average American household could end up paying an extra $1,000 to $1,200 per year.
Wow. Just because of these tariffs.
Yeah, that's the estimate.
That's a significant amount of money.
It is, and it really highlights how tariffs can directly impact people's wallets.
Yeah, even if they don't always realize it.
Right. It might not be immediately obvious, but it adds up.
And it also kind of contradicts, what Trump promised during the campaign.
Oh, right. He said he would lower costs for Americans.
Exactly. So the tariffs, they kind of had the opposite effect.
It's another layer of complexity in this whole story.
It is. It's a reminder that these policies, they have real-world consequences.
They do, and our sources also talk about the World Trade Organization.
The WTO, yeah, they're supposed to be the referees of global trade.
Right, but it sounds like they've been facing some challenges lately.
They have, yeah, there's been a lot of criticism of their effectiveness.
Okay, why is that?
Well, some countries, including the U.S. under Trump, they've been unhappy with some of the WTO's decisions.
I see.
And they've even blocked appointments to the WTO's appellate body, which is the part that settles disputes.
So that weakens the whole system.
It does. If the referee can't enforce the rules, then what's the point?
Right. It raises some big questions about the future of global trade.
It does. I mean, can the WTO adapt to this new world where national interests often clash with, the idea of free trade and cooperation?
It's a huge challenge.
It is, and it's something we need to think about very carefully.
And it's interesting how Trump's messaging on tariffs changed once he was actually in office.
Oh, yeah. How so?
Well, during the campaign, he talked a lot about lowering costs for Americans.
Right. Making things more affordable.
But then, once he started implementing these tariffs,
Yeah.
his tone shifted a bit.
Interesting.
He started saying that, yeah, there might be some short-term pain for consumers,
Okay.
but that it was a necessary sacrifice
For what?
for the greater good of making America great again.
So he's asking people to trust him.
Yeah, to trust that the long-term benefits would outweigh the immediate costs.
But of course, that raises questions about the political calculations involved, right?
It does. Like, were these tariffs really about economic reform?
Or were they just a way to gain political leverage?
Even if it meant hurting certain groups in the short term?
It's a tough question, and it's one that we need to keep asking.
We do, and it also highlights the importance of clear communication.
Absolutely. I mean, how do you explain these complex issues to the public in a way that's both honest and understandable?
Right, because people need to be informed to make good decisions.
They do. They need to understand how these policies affect their lives and hold their leaders accountable.
Speaking of accountability, our sources also mention some of the legal challenges to Trump's actions.
Oh, right. There were a bunch of lawsuits.
There were, questioning the legality, even the constitutionality of some of his executive orders.
Especially the ones related to immigration and trade.
Exactly. And one of the most prominent cases was about his attempt to deny birthright citizenship to certain people.
Oh, wow. The birthright citizenship case.
Yeah, born in the U.S.
Right. I remember that one.
The lawsuit argued that this violated the 14th Amendment.
Which guarantees citizenship to anyone born on U.S. soil.
Right, regardless of their parents' immigration status.
So it was a really fundamental challenge to his authority.
It was, and it sparked this huge debate about presidential power and the role of the courts.
It did. I mean, what are the limits of presidential power?
And who gets to decide those limits?
It was a really important case.
It was. And there was another case about the firing of 2 commissioners from the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Oh, right, the EEOC case?
The lawsuit argued that their dismissals violated this principle of for-cause removal.
Which is designed to protect the independence of certain federal agencies.
Exactly. So they can do their jobs without being subject to political pressure.
It's another example of checks and balances in action.
It is. And so both of these cases, they were really about the scope of presidential power.
And the importance of a strong and independent judiciary.
Right. The courts are there to make sure the other branches of government don't overstep their bounds.
Exactly. They're the guardians of the Constitution.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from the political battles to the legal challenges.
It's amazing how much there is to unpack with this whole tariff thing.
I know, right? It's way more than just a simple economic policy.
It really is. It touches on so many different aspects of our society.
It does, and our sources also include this fascinating historical tidbit that connects us back to the word's origins.
Oh, I love those little historical connections. Tell me more.
It's about the Spanish town of Tarifa.
Tarifa. Okay, I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it.
Well, it turns out that some historians believe that the word tariff actually comes from pirates.
Pirates? Really? That's amazing. Yeah, so the story goes that these pirates, they would hang out around the Strait of Gibraltar,
Okay.
and they'd basically demand payments from ships passing through.
Like a toll.
Exactly. It was like a protection racket, you know. Pay up or else.
Wow. And this was happening in Tarifa.
Yeah, Tarifa was a notorious pirate haven back in the day.
So the word tariff, which now governs global trade, it might have started with pirates shaking down ships.
It's kind of crazy when you think about it, right?
It is. It's like from highway robbery to international trade policy.
And it really shows how much the world has changed, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, back then it was about controlling a physical space, a narrow passage.
Right.
Now it's about economic power, influence on a global scale.
It's amazing how a single word can hold so much history, right?
It really is. It shows how language evolves and adapts,
Yeah.
reflecting the changing world around us.
And tariff is a perfect example of that. So we've talked about the past, but what about the future?
The future of tariff.
Uh-huh.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, like where does it go from here?
Well, trying to predict the future of tariff is, it's a bit like trying to predict the weather.
Okay.
There's so many variables, so many moving parts.
But maybe we can get some clues by looking at where it's been.
I think that's a good approach.
So what do you see when you look back at the journey of tariff?
Well, one thing that stands out is this constant tension between cooperation and competition,
Okay.
between national interests and, you know, the desire for global trade.
Right, those two forces are always pushing and pulling.
And I don't see that tension going away anytime soon. In fact, it might even intensify.
So you think tariff will remain a tool, but
Mhm.
the way it's used will depend on how those global dynamics play out.
Exactly. We might see tariffs used in a more targeted way, you know,
Okay.
focusing on specific industries or countries.
Like a scalpel instead of a hammer.
Exactly. Or we might even see a move away from tariffs altogether.
Really? What would replace them?
Well, it's hard to say, but maybe new forms of economic leverage,
Okay.
or maybe new kinds of trade agreements that address these issues in a different way.
So a lot of uncertainty, but definitely a lot of possibilities.
That's the thing about the future. It's always full of surprises.
And for everyday people, for us,
Mhm.
trying to navigate this complex world, what does it all mean?
Well, I think the most important thing is to stay informed,
Okay.
to understand how these trade policies, how they affect our lives, our jobs, the prices we pay for things.
Right, because ultimately we're the ones who feel the impact.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We, the consumers, are the ones who end up paying the price, literally.
So knowledge is power in this global economy.
It really is. The more you know, the better equipped you are to make informed decisions.
And critical thinking is crucial too, right?
Oh, absolutely. We need to be able to see through the spin, to question assumptions, and to understand the potential consequences of these policies.
It's like we're all players in this global game of trade.
Yeah, whether we realize it or not.
And the more we understand the rules, the better we can play.
I love that analogy. It's so true.
It's not about being passive. It's about being active, engaged.
Exactly. We have a voice, we have a choice.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up.
Sounds good to me.
But before we go, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final question to think about.
Okay.
Looking back at the journey of tariff, from those pirates in Tarifa to the global trade wars of today, what does it tell us about the balance between national interest and global cooperation?
Ooh, That's a good one. It really gets to the heart of the matter.
It does, and it reminds us that the story of tariff, it's not over yet.
It's still being written.
And we all have a role to play in shaping its future.
That's a great way to put it.
So thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of tariff.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
We hope you've learned something new, gained a new perspective.
And maybe even been inspired to learn more.
Because the world of trade, it's complex, it's dynamic.
And it affects all of us.
So stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking questions.
That's the best way to navigate this ever-changing world.
And on that note, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Until then, keep exploring.